In 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, something unexpected happened across its former republics. Millions of ordinary citizens, the very people who had lived under the system their entire lives, reported in survey after survey that they missed it. In 1999, a Gallup poll found that 75% of Russians said life had been better under the Soviet system. So here is the question that almost nobody in the West wants to sit with honestly. What was actually good about living in the USSR? And why do so many people who experience it firsthand remember it not as a prison, but as a home? Before we go any further, let me be absolutely clear about what this is not. This is not an attempt to whitewash the Gulag, or minimize political repression, or pretend the Soviet Union was some kind of paradise. Millions suffered, millions died. That historical record is undeniable, and we have covered it extensively on this channel. But history is not a courtroom where you are only allowed to present one side of the evidence. The Soviet experiment lasted 74 years, spanned 11 time zones, and shaped the daily lives of nearly 300 million people. To say that every single aspect of that experience was uniformly terrible is not serious analysis. It is ideology dressed up as history. And ideology, no matter which direction it flows, is the enemy of understanding. So let us do something harder. Let us look at what actually worked, what people genuinely valued, and why the nostalgia that persists across the former Soviet space is not simply the deluded sentimentality of people who do not know any better. Let us start with the thing that touched every single Soviet citizen from the moment they were born. Healthcare in the Soviet Union was free at the point of use, completely free, no insurance premiums, no co-pays, no medical bankruptcy. The system, known as the Semashko model, after Nikolai Semashko, the first People's Commissar of Health, was established in the early 1920s and became one of the most ambitious public health projects in human history. By the 1960s, the USSR had more doctors per capita than any country in the world. In 1960, the Soviet Union had 20 physicians per 10,000 people. The United States had 14. Think about that for a moment. A country that had been a largely agrarian empire with devastating rates of illiteracy and infant mortality just 40 years earlier was now outpacing the wealthiest nation on earth in physician density. The results were not abstract. Life expectancy in the Russian Empire in 1913 hovered around 32 years. By 1970, Soviet life expectancy had reached 70, nearly matching Western European averages. Infant mortality, which had been catastrophic in the Tsarist period, dropped by over 90%. Diseases like smallpox, cholera, and typhus, which had ravaged the population for centuries, were effectively eliminated through mass vaccination campaigns and sanitation infrastructure. The polio vaccine, developed in parallel with American efforts, was distributed across the entire Soviet Union with a speed and scale that few Western countries could match. Albert Sabin, the American virologist whose oral polio vaccine became the global standard, actually collaborated with Soviet scientists for its mass testing. In 1959, over 10 million Soviet children were vaccinated in a single campaign. The disease was functionally eradicated from Soviet territory within years. Now, was Soviet healthcare perfect? Absolutely not. By the 1980s, the system was showing severe strain. Equipment was outdated. Hospitals in rural areas could be shockingly under-resourced. There was a persistent gap between the elite clinics available to party officials in Moscow and the facilities serving ordinary citizens in Central Asian republics. Corruption crept in, with informal payments to doctors becoming increasingly common. But the foundational principle that no human being should go without medical care because they could not afford it was not merely aspirational, it was operational, and for tens of millions of people, it was the most tangible benefit of the system they lived under. If you are someone who finds these kinds of historical complexities worth exploring, who wants to understand how systems actually functioned rather than just accepting Cold War caricatures from either side, then consider subscribing to this channel. We are building a community of people who dig into the real mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history, the uncomfortable truths alongside the well-known ones. Let us move to education, because this is where the Soviet achievement becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss, even for the system's harshest critics. In 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power, the literacy rate in the Russian Empire was roughly 28%. Among women, it was closer to 13%. In the Central Asian republics in places like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, functional literacy was in the single digits. By 1950, the Soviet literacy rate exceeded 99%. This was not a statistical trick. This was one of the most dramatic educational transformations in recorded history, accomplished in barely a single generation. The campaign was called Lickbez, short for Likvidacja bezgramotnosti, the liquidation of illiteracy. It began in earnest in the 1920s under Lenin's direct instruction, and it mobilized hundreds of thousands of volunteer teachers, many of them barely educated themselves, to fan out across the largest country on earth, into remote villages in Siberia, into yurt settlements on the Kazakh steppe, into mountain communities in the Caucasus, and teach people to read. The effort was staggering in its ambition and, by almost any measure, successful in its execution. But literacy was only the beginning. The Soviet education system, once established, was rigorous, standardized, and relentlessly focused on mathematics, science, and engineering. Soviet schools operated on a uniform curriculum across all 15 republics. A student in Minsk learned the same physics as a student in Vladivostok. Higher education was free, not subsidized, free. And access was, at least in theory, and often in practice, based on academic merit rather than family wealth. The son of a factory worker in Sverdlovsk could, and regularly did, end up studying nuclear physics at Moscow State University. This was not a utopian fantasy. This was the system that produced the scientists who built Sputnik. And here is where we hit one of those moments that should make everyone pause, regardless of their political sympathies. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into orbit. Sputnik weighed 83 kilograms and circled the Earth every 96 minutes, emitting a simple radio pulse that could be picked up by amateur radio operators worldwide. The sound was haunting, a steady beep that announced to the entire planet that the country, which had been a feudal backwater less than half a century earlier, had just beaten the most technologically advanced nation in history into space. The American response was not merely surprise. It was panic. The National Defense Education Act of 1958 was passed specifically because American lawmakers believed their education system was falling behind the Soviet one. The irony is extraordinary. The Soviet education model, built on the ashes of illiteracy, became so effective that it forced the United States to overhaul its own schools. Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space, was the son of a carpenter and a dairy farmer from a small village in the Smolensk region. He attended a vocational school, then a technical college, then flight school. His journey from a mud road village to the cosmos was not an accident. It was the product of a system designed deliberately and structurally to identify talent regardless of social origin and funnel it toward the state's priorities. Whether you admire or despise those priorities, the machinery that produced Gagarin was real, and it worked. Now let us talk about something more intimate, something that shaped daily life in ways that are often overlooked in Western accounts: housing. The Soviet Union guaranteed housing as a constitutional right. Article 44 of the 1977 Soviet Constitution stated that citizens had the right to housing and the state was obligated to provide it. Rent in the Soviet Union was astonishingly low, typically consuming no more than 3 to 5% of a family's income. Utilities, heating, electricity, water were similarly subsidized to the point of being almost negligible costs. Compare this to the modern reality in virtually any major Western city, where housing costs consume 30, 40, sometimes 50% of a household's income, and the contrast is stark. The famous Khrushchevka apartment blocks, those five-story prefabricated concrete buildings that still dot the landscape of every post-Soviet city, are easy to mock. They were small, they were ugly. The walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbors' arguments about dinner. But here is what they represented in context. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union had lost an estimated 25 million citizens, and approximately 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages had been partially or completely destroyed. The housing crisis was not a policy failure. It was the consequence of the most destructive war in human history being fought largely on Soviet soil. Nikita Khrushchev launched a mass housing construction program in the late 1950s that built millions of apartments in under a decade. Between 1956 and 1970, approximately 127 million Soviet citizens, nearly half the population, received new housing. These were not luxury apartments, but they were warm, they had running water, they had electricity, and they were effectively free. For families who had spent the previous decade living in communal apartments with 6 other families, sharing a single kitchen and a single bathroom, a private 2-room Khrushchevka felt like a revelation. There is a statistic that rarely appears in Western analyses of the Soviet Union, and it deserves attention. Homelessness in the Soviet Union was, for most of its history, functionally non-existent. The 1927 Criminal Code actually made homelessness a prosecutable offense, which raises its own ethical questions, but the structural reality was that the state provided housing to virtually everyone. The concept of sleeping on the street because you could not afford a roof was essentially alien to Soviet citizens. When they encountered it in Western cities after 1991, many were genuinely shocked. Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize-winning Belarusian journalist, recorded dozens of testimonies from ordinary Soviet citizens in her book Second-Hand Time, who expressed precisely this bewilderment. They had expected capitalism to mean abundance. They had not expected it to mean that some people would have nothing at all. Let us shift to employment, because this is another area where the Soviet system delivered something that its citizens valued deeply and missed acutely after its collapse. Unemployment in the Soviet Union was, officially and in practical terms, essentially zero. The state guaranteed employment. Every citizen had the right to a job, and the state was obligated to provide one. This was not merely a propaganda claim. The planned economy was structured around full employment as a fundamental principle. Factories were often deliberately overstaffed. Productivity per worker was frequently low by Western standards. Economists called it hidden unemployment, where 10 workers did the job that 5 could have handled. But from the perspective of the individual citizen, the result was security. You knew you would have a job. You knew you would have an income. You knew that income would be enough to cover your basic needs because housing, healthcare, education, and food staples were all either free or heavily subsidized. The psychological weight of this security is difficult to overstate, and it is something that becomes visible only in its absence. After 1991, when the Soviet economy was subjected to rapid privatization and shock therapy reforms advised by Western economists, unemployment exploded. In Russia alone, industrial output fell by roughly 45% in the 1990s, a collapse more severe than the Great Depression in the United States. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped from 64 in 1990 to 57 by 1994, a peacetime demographic catastrophe almost without parallel in modern history. Alcoholism, suicide, and poverty surged. The contrast between the guaranteed stability of the Soviet system, however economically inefficient, and the chaos that followed its collapse is central to understanding why nostalgia persists. People did not miss the ideology, they missed knowing that tomorrow would be survivable. There is another dimension of Soviet life that is almost never discussed in Western media, and it is one that surprises people when they first encounter it: the extraordinary investment in culture and the arts. The Soviet Union subsidized culture on a scale that no capitalist society has ever matched. Theater tickets cost kopecks. Ballet, opera, symphony orchestras, all were accessible to ordinary workers. The Bolshoi Theater in Moscow was not an exclusive venue for the elite. Factory workers attended performances regularly, often through organized group outings arranged by their workplace trade unions. Public libraries were everywhere. The Soviet Union published more books per capita than any country in the world. In 1970, the USSR published approximately 80,000 titles annually, more than the United States and the United Kingdom combined. Cinema was similarly democratized. Soviet film studios, particularly Mosfilm, produced works that competed at the highest levels of international cinema. Andrei Tarkovsky's films were celebrated at Cannes. Sergei Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin remains one of the most influential films ever made. And these were not niche artistic experiences available only to intellectuals in Moscow. Films were distributed through a nationwide network of cinemas, including mobile projection units that traveled to remote rural areas. The idea that culture was a luxury for the wealthy was antithetical to Soviet ideology. And whatever you think of that ideology, its practical effect was that a steelworker in Magnitogorsk had access to world-class art. The sports system deserves mention here too, because it produced results that still echo today. Soviet athletes dominated Olympic competition for decades. Between 1952 and 1988, the Soviet Union topped the medal table at every Summer Olympics it attended except 1968. The sports infrastructure was built on a system of youth identification and development that was, in its scope and organization, unlike anything the world had seen. Children were screened for athletic potential at young ages and channeled into specialized sports schools. Training was free. Equipment was provided. Coaches were state-employed professionals. The results were extraordinary. Gymnasts like Olga Korbut and Larissa Latinina, hockey players who humiliated professional NHL teams, chess grandmasters who dominated the World Championship for decades. The 1972 Soviet hockey team's victory over Canada in the Summit Series and the near victory that preceded the Miracle on Ice loss to the United States in 1980 were products of this system. But let us zoom out for a moment and consider something broader, something structural that underpinned many of these individual achievements. The Soviet Union, for all its failures, operated on a principle that is worth examining dispassionately. The idea that certain human needs, housing, healthcare, education, employment, culture, were too important to be left to the market. This was not a peripheral feature of the system. It was its central organizing logic. And while the execution was often deeply flawed, while shortages were real, while the quality of goods and services frequently lagged behind the West, while political freedom was brutally suppressed, the underlying premise created a social floor below which citizens generally could not fall. The concept of economic anxiety, the gnawing daily fear of job loss, medical bills, rent increases, or educational debt was largely absent from Soviet life. This is not a romantic projection. It is what people consistently report in oral histories, in sociological surveys, and in the extensive interview-based research conducted by scholars like Alexei Yurchak, whose book Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More meticulously documents the texture of late Soviet daily life. People were not paralyzed by gratitude toward the state. Many were cynical about official ideology, made jokes about the party, and privately dismissed propaganda. But they also felt a baseline security that vanished overnight when the system collapsed. Women's experiences in the Soviet Union present another complicated but important picture. The USSR was the first major nation to legalize abortion in 1920. It was among the first to guarantee equal pay for equal work, at least in law. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers during and after World War II and remained there. By the 1970s, women made up approximately 51% of the Soviet workforce, a participation rate that most Western nations would not approach for decades. Soviet women were engineers, doctors, scientists, factory managers. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963, a full 20 years before Sally Ride. Generous maternity leave policies, state-funded childcare, and guaranteed employment after childbirth were structural features of the system, not afterthoughts. Now, this picture had its own deep contradictions. Women were still expected to perform the vast majority of domestic labor, a phenomenon Soviet sociologists themselves called the double burden. Political power at the highest levels remained overwhelmingly male. And the quality of state childcare varied enormously. But the structural supports that existed for working mothers were real and substantive, and their sudden disappearance after 1991 had devastating effects on women across the former Soviet Union. Let us talk about one more thing that rarely enters Western discussions about the Soviet Union: the genuine sense of collective purpose that many citizens felt, particularly in certain historical moments. The reconstruction after World War II is perhaps the most powerful example. The Soviet Union had suffered losses that are almost incomprehensible. 27 million dead, 60% of the country's industrial capacity destroyed. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Stalingrad, Minsk, Kiev, Sevastopol, these were not merely damaged, they were obliterated. And yet, within a decade, the Soviet Union had rebuilt its industrial base, constructed millions of new housing units, and launched a space program. The human cost of this reconstruction was immense, and much of it was achieved through coercion and sacrifice that bordered on exploitation. But the subjective experience for many citizens was one of shared purpose, of contributing to something larger than themselves, of building a future from ashes. This is not propaganda. It is documented in thousands of personal letters, diaries, and memoirs. The pioneer and Komsomol youth organizations, whatever their ideological functions, also provided something that many former participants remember fondly: structure, community, and a sense of belonging. Summer camps in the Crimea or the forests of the Urals, group hikes, sports competitions, music performances, science clubs, these were experiences that shaped childhoods. The most famous of these camps, Artek in Crimea, hosted children from across the Soviet Union and from dozens of foreign countries. For a child from a small town in Siberia, spending a summer at Artek alongside children from Cuba, India, and East Germany was a formative horizon-expanding experience. The ideological indoctrination was real, but so was the genuine joy and community that many participants recall. Here is a pattern interrupt that deserves attention. In 2018, the Levada Center, Russia's most respected independent polling organization, found that 66% of Russians regretted the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Among those over 55, the figure was 76%. This is not a fringe sentiment, it is a majority position. And it is not limited to Russia. Surveys across the former Soviet republics, from Armenia to Ukraine to Kazakhstan, consistently show significant minorities, and in some cases majorities, expressing nostalgia for certain aspects of the Soviet system. In a 2009 Pew Research Center poll, 72% of Hungarians said most people were better off under communism. In the former East Germany, the phenomenon even has its own word, nostalgia. The temptation, from a Western perspective, is to dismiss this as ignorance, false consciousness, or the selective memory of old people romanticizing their youth, and certainly some of it is that. But when the sentiment is this widespread, this persistent, and this consistent across different countries and demographics, dismissing it becomes intellectually lazy. Something real is being mourned, and understanding what that something is matters not just for historical accuracy, but for grasping the political dynamics of the post-Soviet world today. What was being mourned was not the Communist Party. It was not censorship. It was not the KGB. What was being mourned was predictability, community, and a social contract that, however imperfectly fulfilled, promised that the basic material conditions of a dignified life would be met. A roof, a job, healthcare, education, a pension. The ability to send your children to summer camp. The knowledge that your elderly parents would be taken care of. These were not luxuries in the Soviet Union. They were baseline expectations, and their disappearance, virtually overnight, was experienced not as liberation, but as abandonment. The transportation system deserves mention because it illustrates how the Soviet approach to public goods differed fundamentally from market-based models. The Moscow Metro, opened in 1935, was not merely a transit system. It was a cathedral of public space, with stations designed by leading architects featuring marble walls, mosaic ceilings, bronze sculptures, and chandeliers. Stalin's direct involvement in the metro's aesthetic was well documented. He wanted stations that would make workers feel like they were entering palaces. The propaganda intent was obvious, but the result was a public transit system of extraordinary beauty that was also extraordinarily affordable. A single ride cost 5 kopecks for decades, a price so low it was essentially symbolic. The system moved millions of people daily with remarkable efficiency. Long-distance rail travel was similarly affordable. A worker in Leningrad could take a train to visit relatives in Tbilisi, a journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers, for a price that represented a small fraction of their monthly salary. Air travel, managed by the state airline Aeroflot, which at its peak was the largest airline in the world, was similarly priced to be accessible to ordinary citizens. The vacation system was another feature that people remember with particular warmth. Soviet trade unions managed an extensive network of sanatoriums and rest houses, from the Black Sea coast to the forests of the Baltic republics to the mountains of Central Asia. Workers received subsidized or free vacation stays, typically for 2 to 4 weeks annually. The 1936 Soviet Constitution guaranteed the right to rest and leisure, and the trade union vacation system was the mechanism for delivering it. By the 1970s, millions of Soviet workers vacationed annually at state facilities. The quality varied enormously, from comfortable resort-style accommodations on the Crimean coast to Spartan facilities in provincial towns. But the principle that working people deserved regular, affordable rest in pleasant surroundings was embedded in the system's architecture. Now, here is the crucial analytical point that ties all of this together. Every single benefit described above came at a cost, and those costs were severe. Political freedom was non-existent. Dissent was punished, sometimes with imprisonment, sometimes with psychiatric institutionalization, sometimes with death. Consumer goods were frequently unavailable. The economy was riddled with inefficiencies. Innovation outside of military and space applications was stifled. Environmental destruction was catastrophic, from the draining of the Aral Sea to the Chernobyl disaster. Corruption was pervasive. Information was controlled. Travel abroad was restricted.
ethnic minorities face discrimination and at times mass deportation. These are not footnotes, they are central features of the system.
But here is what makes the Soviet experience genuinely important for anyone trying to understand the modern world. The USSR demonstrated, on a massive scale, that it is structurally possible to eliminate homelessness, provide universal health care, guarantee employment, make higher education free, and democratize access to culture. It did all of these things, it did them imperfectly, often brutally, and within a framework of political repression that is indefensible. But it proved that these outcomes are not utopian fantasies. They are policy choices. The question that the Soviet experiment poses to the present is not whether we should replicate the Soviet system. Obviously, we should not. The question is why so many of the social guarantees that the USSR provided, however clumsily, are treated as impossible dreams in societies with vastly greater wealth and productive capacity. This is ultimately what the nostalgia is about. It is not a longing for Stalin or the Politburo. It is a longing for the feeling that the society you lived in was at least trying to take care of its people. That feeling was real. Its foundations were real, and its absence in the decades since the Soviet collapse has shaped the politics, the culture, and the psychology of hundreds of millions of people in ways that the rest of the world is only beginning to understand. The Soviet Union was many things simultaneously: a superpower, a prison, a laboratory, a community, and a promise that was never fully kept but never entirely broken. To understand it honestly, you have to hold all of those truths at once. And that perhaps is the hardest thing to do in a world that prefers its history in black and white.